or big challenges. So it seems that we have a kind of a range of problems because people don't know where their water comes from, and yet even if you do know where your water comes from, the complexity of the system itself, we have to constantly question our assumptions and be trying to understand how the ecosystem itself is reacting, and this introduction of the snails narrative has definitely, I think, surprised a lot of scientists in the area. So the audience is starting to ask questions, which is awesome, and I'd like to just go from my questions to your questions, if you don't mind. And one of the questions is about the BMPs. Considering that you're saying they're struggling, what kinds of new BMPs and or legislation would you sort of innovate around and to try to improve water quality?
The BMPs are basically real common sense, practical solutions. They do things like a minimum amount of irrigation whenever possible, so you keep track of the weather. If it's Thursday and there's a big frontal system predicted for Friday, you don't turn on the irrigation system, right? You just hold off. And they look at application of fertilizers exactly when the plants need it the most. And they want to use just a minimum amount of fertilizers also. But I think you can only go so far with the BMPs. And out of these karst plains that are the watersheds for our springs, I think ultimately we may have to go to something like limit the amount of acreage that can be actually farmed in the karst plains. I really don't think that it's going to be, we can get around doing that someday. We're going to have to do that if we want to keep these springs in good shape. And one of my interests has always been the animals that live down there. These caves under our feet are more than just piping systems that move water around. They're these really unique environments and habitats. And we've got, like in Florida, we have 17 species of cave-adapted crayfish, including this little bitty thing that's no more than 2 inches long called the spider cave crayfish. It's the most widely or wildly adapted crayfish of them all. They call it the spider cave crayfish because even though its body is 2 inches long, its legs are a lot longer and has antennae that are like 5 inches long. And probably the biggest threat to these guys, I go out in some of these karst plains, like up and around the Mariana area, and almost every inch of that county and those watersheds is in agriculture right now. And the animals seem to be doing fine. But our groundwater is naturally low in oxygen. As rain falls through the atmosphere, it picks up oxygen, it picks up carbon dioxide, right, to make the weak carbonic acid that actually dissolves the limestone. But as that water trickles on down in, it starts losing oxygen. There's a lot of ways to lose oxygen, but no way to pick it back up. And these little crave animals are adapted to fairly low levels of oxygen. If you got 2 parts per million oxygen in the aquifer, that's suitable for these guys. But we've had a number of instances now where we get into really drought periods and the groundwater just quits flowing. The springs quit flowing, the caves that are back behind the springs quit flowing, and we've had mass die-offs of the cave animals. So far, they've recolonized these places. We don't really know where they go to hang out while this is going on, but I can see where that could be a real problem for these little guys.
Yeah, I think what Tom makes is a good point here on BMPs, and a lot of the BMPs have been developed statewide. What works well in the Everglades isn't necessarily going to work well up here, and even what works well in western Alachua County is going to be very different in eastern Alachua County. So the aquifer is more vulnerable in certain areas. Some areas have very thick layers of clay where you won't have as much leaching, whereas when you get in these karst plains, they're much more vulnerable and susceptible to pollution. So something that would be good is a development of best management practices for localized areas. So there maybe needs to be a karst plains BMP, and if that limits the type of crop or something that you're doing. But we need a closer examination of these BMPs and how they're working in, I think, a localized version of it.
And just one step before that, we need to continue to learn more about these places. There needs to be studies to actually understand where the water is going, how it's moving, and how it's affecting these places. In a lot of areas we do know a lot of areas we don't. So there has to be funding there available to learn, and then get those protections in place.
Okay, so studies that show the impact of BMPs, and then perhaps tailored BMPs for specific areas, so everything has to be context specific. There is no one size fits all. And, I think Tom makes a good point that it really, in the Everglades, it's one thing, and in Swanee Valley, it's a different thing. And so we can't really just have one manual and use it in these different places randomly. So one of the questions that came in was a little scary, but I'm gonna read it anyway. But with the current administration's pushing for deregulation, do you have any hope?
I'm a real pessimist. And I hate to be that way, I'm not that way by nature, but these things are going in kind of the wrong direction right now.
I'm an optimist. We balance each other out real well. I think that we need to, the more you understand these issues, it's really hard to maintain your hope. And let's be real here, it really is. But it's important to continue moving forward, and I think that there's been so much hype, I guess you could call it, and buzz that's picking up, specifically surrounding the, I can't believe I'm bringing this up, but the Nestle issue. There's more people than ever now that are aware that Florida's water is actually at risk, and its springs are at risk. That's just one example. And things like that are what give me hope. There's a lot of misconceptions surrounding the Nestle issue particularly, but I think that the fact that it's raising awareness, and we need more things like that to raise awareness, and if anything changes our trajectory, it's going to be people knowing that our springs and our water are a threat and going and turning that into action. We need to be there whenever they're asking what they can do to protect the springs and to protect our water with accurate and feasible solutions to the issue.
Yeah, I'm chastised, Tessa. No, Tessa's right. I think actually the population is more educated today than they've ever been as far as our groundwater problems. That's what this whole film was about, right? Education of the public. And there's lots of little things we can do in our everyday lives. I tend to take Navy showers now. I get great satisfaction out of that, right? I really try to conserve water, and it's fun, once you kind of get your mind into it. Anyhow.
Yeah, and I think since this is a political question, something hopeful to be found is that the environment can really be a nonpartisan issue. I think across political parties, everybody kind of cares for the environment. Tom told me this film was actually funded by Jeb Bush. The recent government race, so a lot of the issues were dominated by harmful algal blooms. I think really drove much of the voters to the polls. And our governor just recently appointed a new position, a chief science advisor, to advise on policy, and that's U.S. owned Tom Frazier, who has done a lot of work in the Springs. So I think there still is a lot to be hopeful about.
Actually, just coming back to the question of, you brought up the issue of Nestle and the bottling of the water. Somebody from the audience did ask a little bit about that, not specifically naming the company, but they asked if the amount of water taken is going to have a major impact on the groundwater. And I just wanted to know if anyone on the panel can answer that.
Probably no real impact on the groundwater. The amount of water the bottled water operations are using is not very much.
Not that much.
yeah, it just is not a lot. And I found a study by a university type that had looked at bottled water operations all over the country. He looked at like 50 different ones, and he only found one that he identified as being abusing the resource, pumping way too much. The rest of them seem to have not very much of an impact. It's just kind of a drop in the bucket compared to all the other water uses.
I know there's no doubt Nestle is a horrible corporation. There are a lot of ways, yes. But their economic self-interest aligns directly with springs conservation. If their water, if the spring water that they're bottling is polluted, they can no longer bottle it. So they have interest in protecting the resource. And I think that is why a lot of water bottlers aren't abusing the resources. Personally, I don't drink out of plastic water bottles, but there is that, and I think that's pretty much where a lot of the misconceptions lie. But like Tom said, it's another drop in the bucket. Any amount of the aquifer is going to harm the springs. But I personally would like to see all of that hype that's surrounding the water bottling being directed at the real issues, and that's politics. That's our state agencies.
Okay, well, one of the questions was about local government, and it was about regulating further development of landscape that requires irrigation, like golf courses and housing developments with lawns. Is there any talk of that?
I think there is talk about doing restrictions and setting regulations for new development, how much area can be turf. There's a Florida Water Star program that's kind of leading the way on this, and so only a certain percentage should be heavily irrigated while the rest is in micro irrigation. I think it'd be great if we just went away from lawns altogether. I mean, we said earlier, 60% of water use is on lawns, so that could be a huge savings. I mean, we're not even eating this is just grass we're growing just for the looks of it. So, and that needs to start with a change with everybody. I mean, that's a behavioral change that needs to happen. And maybe it will. I think it's happened in California during periods of drought. So as the resource becomes much more limited, I think we'll have to move in that direction.
Yeah, if you want to see a couple of good videos, they've been around a while. One of them, it has to do with lawns, right, and their impacts. One of them is called Gimme Green, and the other one is Green Monster. And they're really funny, and they're right on the money. Yeah.
So this is not going to become lawn shaming, but so coming back to that big question of accounting for future growth. How do we go about accounting for future growth? Somebody from the audience wanted to know how we can find management balance to growth and water resources at a statewide and local level. Any ideas as we look forward?
I didn't catch all of the question because diving has pretty much wrecked my ears.
Be more succinct, because I don't think that was. How would you advise accounting for future growth in Florida and finding a management balance to growth and water resources, statewide and local? Do you have ideas, Tessa?
Yeah, sure. Okay. A couple of ways. Back to studies, understanding where our water is going, and also building up and not out when we're talking about development. But going back to studies, to understand where the mass amounts, so these conduits, they vary in size as you saw in the film, and in these really sensitive areas where there's a lot of water moving, those are well, it depends on how much flow there is, a lot of variables, but those are some of the worst places to put a farm or to put a development where the water can't reach the system to recharge. So understanding where those really sensitive areas are and building around them. I'm an optimist, but I try to be as much of a realist as possible. We're not going to stop growing, so we have to plan for that. and I believe developing and farming around those sensitive areas, and then limiting the nutrients and the pumping, capping groundwater consumption in those larger conduits, which there's a lot, is also part of the solution.
Yeah, the water management districts have a program called Minimum Flows and Levels, MFLs. And the gist of the whole thing is that they have looked at our rivers and our lakes and our springs and made kind of a subjective decision about how low we can let these things go before they suffer too much harm, right? And that's what they base the amount of water permits that they issue on. They haven't gotten the minimum flows and levels for all of our lakes and rivers yet, but they're working on it. And supposedly that will take care of the problem. But a lot of people think that they're over permitting already. A little more water is being drawn out and used than we should be taking at this point.
I think that a lot of the MFLs, I think every single one of them, in my opinion, I'm not a scientist, are not, they're insufficient. And a lot of time, they're using in the literature, it's the best available data to them. And, I've come to realize over time this, and not all, but a lot of these studies, in comparison with studies side by side, are not completely truthful. They're cutting historical data. I possibly at times go as far as to say it's political science, not all, but some. And I think that comparison studies and challenging the models, the best available data that they have, may be our only options for certain areas.
Yeah, I think this is a huge challenge. I mean, there's 21 million people in Florida now. In the next 80 years, it's supposed to more than triple how we provide water for 100 million people. I don't know. That's a huge challenge.
That's the big challenge. Yeah.
So I just want to note that we could just keep talking all night, but we only have about 7 minutes left. So I'm going to have to wrap it up. And one of the questions that came from the audience and was something I wanted to ask is, if you don't work for the water management district, or you're not a scientist, or you're not working for the local government, what can you do? What can just average people living in Gainesville do to help resolve this issue? You can just offer us, as we leave tonight, some hopeful ideas on how everyone can try to make a difference.
I think you can support land conservation. That's been a big one. Alachua County Forever is a program that's accepting nominations. So, good karst areas you want to nominate for conservation. One of them, famous from this film, the Alachua Sink or the Mill Creek Sink, has been nominated, and hopefully that will go into conservation. So I think that's a positive thing. The other thing you can do is get rid of your lawn.
Yeah, Wes used to talk about it's like a swimming pool. If you want to protect the springs, you have to protect the filter. That's that filter that's out there in the ag fields and under our houses and our lawns and in our cities, right? We need to take good care of the landscape. What we have now is a landscape level problem, and it's going to take landscape level solutions. There's just no two ways about that.
Exactly.
And it's great to take the Navy showers and turn the faucet off when you're using it, but we're going to have to go beyond those kind of things. It's going to take landscape level solutions.
This is a good opportunity to talk about solutions to the problem as a whole. And I think land conservation 100% is probably the best way. I mean, if we could just conserve all the land, that'd be great. Donate your land. Also, just back to educating everybody sharing on social media, having in-person conversations with them, talking with your family, getting your water tested, and just being in the know about these things. It's of the utmost importance. And I like to urge people to ponder on and consider what the things that we do want rather than constantly preaching about the things that we don't want, right? You know, there's a lot of experts out there, and we need to be working on these solutions together, right? And I think the biggest back to the misconception question, I think it's a huge misconception that people think it's going to be easy and that it's going to be free to save these places, to save our drinking water. This should be at the top of our priorities, not just the springs, it's our drinking water. So attending meetings, you know, commission meetings, water management district meetings, they like to schedule these things when everybody's at work, but my gosh, show up, especially if you're young. Especially if you're young. Don't be afraid to talk up or speak up. Don't be afraid to talk with other people, reach out to other experts. And I promise you, we all care about these places and take the time to answer your questions and that sort of thing. So the Florida Springs Institute is a great resource. So the Florida Springs Council. There's, you know, FloridaSprings.org is also a great educational resource. There's a lot out there. Shoot, if you have questions, just reach out to me, reach out to the Institute, anybody. So.
And vote for politicians that seem to really care about
Okay, so I think from that smorgasbord of opportunities, you can all find one or two or three that you can commit to. And I want to thank our panelists for being here tonight. Thank you all for being here, and hopefully you can pass this message on to those you hardly ever talk to.
So now that I've kind of branded myself as a pessimist here tonight, I want to say that these springs we have here in Florida are really, really great. They're something. They're the best in the world. And I've traveled around the world, right, to springs in different countries, and Florida's great. It's a cool place. And you know the movie you just watched, remember when we were down, Jill and I were in that little tight stuff, and we're kind of stuck and not moving very fast, and Wes is getting worried about us up on the surface. Well, when they showed the movie for the first time, it was in the old Antique Priest Theater in High Springs. And my daughter, who's the same age as Tessa, what would you have been then? About 7 years old? Maybe?
Yeah, I was 8.
Yeah. So my daughter's sitting there beside me, and the tension is building, right? And she grabs my arm, and she goes, "Daddy, are you going to get out of that cage?" Yeah. I said, "I think so."
Okay, so thank you all so much. Thanks to the audience. If you have a chance to stop and give us some feedback, either by sticky note, or I think there'll be some people trying to evaluate the program. We'd love to hear what you think, especially as we're going to have 3 more of these. So mark your calendar for April 7th. We are going to be watching another wonderful film called Lost Springs. And I see Margaret Tolbert in the audience who worked on that film, and it's a really neat